It got a lot of press because Kate Winslet, who's one of the main actors in that movie, she now holds the record for the longest breath hold on set, on a movie set. Before it was who was it? The guy for the Top Gun guy. Why am I blanking on his name? Doesn't matter. Anyway, so she held her breath for over 7 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And she was getting a lot of press for it. So I had to go out there and I said, and basically wrote this piece on The Conversation explaining how she did it. And she did it using supplementary oxygen. So pre-breathing on that 100% oxygen.
We can all hold our breath, of course, at least for a while. And many of us, if not all of us, can swim, including below the water surface. So are we, human beings, evolutionarily adapted for diving? Still today, there are human communities that dive for their food, and global records for the duration and depths of dives by professional competitors are breathtaking. And yet at the same time, the murky depths of the sea are clearly so inhospitable to us. The cold, the dark, the water pressure, and of course, the fact that we simply cannot breathe. There are many stories, many movies about people surviving and dying beneath the waves. So what's the physiology and psychology of diving? How good are we at diving? And when diving becomes dangerous, what exactly goes wrong? Well, Dr. Anthony Bain researches human cardiovascular and cerebrovascular function, and he also studies professional breath hold divers from Croatia. Anthony, welcome.
Nice to be here.
Thanks so much for having this discussion with me. I'm so excited, so interested to pick your brains on all things breath hold diving. And actually, I'll just deal with that to start with. So breath hold diving is as it sounds, the idea of diving underwater and holding one's breath as opposed to taking an aqua lung, so taking oxygen along for the ride. And I think we're going to be focusing mostly on situations where people are underwater, they're swimming, so they're active, but they're also holding their breath, so they've only got the oxygen stored within their body to use. It's a strange situation because you've got at the same time a requirement for an increase in oxygen, you know, beating the legs, maybe using the arms as well, while at the same time, of course, having very little oxygen because we all like to breathe frequently. Anthony, can I start with a question, a sort of general question? Do you think that humans are to some degree adapted for diving?
Yeah, I think humans are actually, we are adapted to diving. We are, I mean, we're not diving creatures like seals and whales, but we do have the leftover reflexes that do make us adequate divers. So we could get into those reflexes, and we could even go back to the history of diving. When you look at communities of divers, we can go back 2,000 years or more, and we see groups of people that have been diving, usually for food on the seafloor. So the most famous are the Ama divers of Japan, mostly female divers, and they're most famous for pearls, but they generally are going down there for clams. And there's reports of them back in 2,000 years ago. So we've been diving for a long time. And in fact, when you look at these groups of people, the most famous, I guess scientifically looked at most recently, is the Baju in South America. And there was a paper published a few years back in Cell, which is a really good journal. And they actually found that these groups of people that dive for a living, they spend up to 60% of the time in the water while at work. They actually have these adaptations. The biggest one is they have big spleens, and your spleen can hold a lot of oxygen-rich blood. So when they dive, their spleen will actually contract and then provide more oxygen in their blood, so they're not requiring their lungs as much. So we humans are adapted. We're actually, fairly good divers when you compare to other animals, other mammals. Obviously, notwithstanding the seals and the whales and the dolphins, but we are good divers compared to other mammals on the earth.
So that's really fascinating. So if I can just try and pull that apart a little bit to some extent. So first of all, we might imagine that when we hold our breath and dive underwater, that the oxygen available to us is what's in our lungs from that air we've just gulped. But you're saying there's more to it than that. There are other parts of the body that are also storing oxygen that, at least in part, we have access to.
Yeah. Now, by far, the most of the oxygen that when we dive is coming from the lungs, no doubt. But there is this added bit that's stored in there in the spleen, and so that can contract and release that oxygen-rich blood. Yeah, but by far, it's in the lungs. Now, it's a little bit different.
So there's some in the muscle as well, beg your pardon. There's some in the muscle, is that true? Maybe 10% or something, I can't remember, but a noteworthy storage of oxygen that we can access is actually in our muscles, in myoglobin.
In the myoglobin, yeah, a little bit in myoglobin. Now, not nearly as much. When you look at seals, for example, they don't rely as much on their lungs. In fact, if you've ever seen a seal dive, most of them will actually exhale before the dive. And there's reasons for that. The main one is to avoid that squeeze that you get when you go at depth. Boyle's law, when you go down at depth, the volume of air will actually compress. So they rely more on the oxygen stored in their muscle, the oxygen stored in their bloods. They have different hemoglobin carrying capacities, and they have very large spleens. So
it's a small proportion of the oxygen in the seal's body, a small proportion of the oxygen available to them is in the lungs, and actually much more of it is in kind of uncompressible parts of the body.
Right, yeah. And they have a different type of myoglobin. So myoglobin is the protein that holds oxygen in the muscle. Their myoglobin is a little bit different than human myoglobin. And so it's able to release more oxygen, store more oxygen than we are.
Wow. Okay. And I think it's the case for seals that actually their lungs collapse. Obviously, they're designed to collapse. They collapse beyond maybe a few tens of meters.
Yeah.
So whereas a human lung, if it collapsed because of the pressure of water, well, we've had it. The lungs, it's actually designed to collapse, and I guess that air gets pushed back up into the throat, into the trachea. I'm not sure actually.
Yeah. So now again, I'm not a comparative physiologist, but my understanding is that the airways, so the bronchi of the seals, they have more sort of rigidity to them, or cartilage around there, that will collapse and then keep the air in the alveoli. Whereas humans, it's collapsing, especially the alveoli, the air pockets are going to be collapsing, right? And once we get into the dangers of diving, that kind of is the underlining reason for any injury when you go down deep is that what we call barotrauma, that squeeze, that lung squeeze that humans get. And before humans dive, we have to take a deep breath in, because again, most of the oxygen is coming from our lungs. So we take a deep breath in, and then so there's a lot to compress at that point.
So we might be, we'll perhaps come on to more the problems at depth in a while, but so human beings in a sense have a problem. Like you say, we're adapted, and we might be a bit, but we're not brilliantly adapted. As you say, we're not like a seal, because
we're not like a seal, yeah.
So much of our oxygen is our lungs that we naturally, really, don't we, involuntarily almost take a breath before we would dive. So certainly we want to take a breath before we dive, but that means we've got loads of air in our lungs. And actually, if the lungs collapse because of the pressure of the water, it's probably game over for us, really. And also, we've got a high buoyancy then, like we're bobbing around like a balloon on a bath, on the top of bath water. It's very hard work to push against that positive buoyancy, to drive our own bodies into the water when we've got a lung full of air. very hard to then drive our own body, like trying to drag a balloon into the water. It's surprisingly difficult. But okay, but nonetheless, maybe compared to some mammals or many mammals, humans are pretty good. Do we have an idea of in what ways humans are relatively, we're no seal, we're no whale, but we're better than a lot of animals when it comes to diving? Are we able to sort of, what measures would say that we're relatively good divers?
Well, the another thing that we should talk about is the other sort of adaptation to diving, which is the mammalian dive reflex. And humans have the mammalian dive reflex, and that is a conservation of oxygen when we dive, and a organization of or redistribution of our oxygen-rich blood to the organs where we need it, namely the heart and the brain. So we constrict the periphery, the peripheral, like the hands, your feet, your skin. The blood vessels constrict, then redistribute blood back up to the heart, back up to the brain where you need it. So humans do that quite well. And the other thing is we also slow our heart rate. So by slowing our heart rate, especially when we cool the face, a lot of the mammalian dive reflex comes from facial cooling. We've got these nerves called trigeminal nerves. When activated, that will slow your heart rate through the vagus nerve, through the vagus pathway. So you slow your heart rate, you slow your metabolism, you slow your usage of oxygen. So going back to your question, how do we know, compared to a dog, for example? To be honest with you, I don't think those studies have been done because it's very hard to train a dog to hold their breath for a long time. But if you know of any comparative studies in that sense, I'd be interested to hear.
Well, I'll have to dig out the old literature on that. I know there must have been some guys back in the 50s who stuck dogs' faces in the water. I'll have to check. Yeah. In all seriousness, early diving work with non-humans, from what I remember, actually, it brings back memories, is problematic in the sense that the animals were stressed.
Right.
So you're getting kind of escape responses mixed up with dive responses, and also sometimes, so for animals like ducks, if you kind of force it underwater and then temporarily put a lid on top of the tank, the duck's response to that is much more extreme than if it voluntarily dives, as a lot of duck species do.
Yeah.
So to be honest, some of the old literature is, a little bit unsavory and not very clear. Yeah. Whereas, of course, with human beings, fortunately, you're always asking them to be voluntary. But we can go back to those natural studies. So the Bajau divers in South America, larger spleen effectively expands the oxygen storage that they take with them underwater. I suspect they're also very good at decreasing heart rate as a kind of proxy for a decrease in metabolic rate. So they've got a bigger tank of petrol, and they use that petrol more slowly. Do we actually know whether the larger spleen is an evolved adaptation, or whether they develop that during their lifetime, or because they are a diver? In other words, before they start diving, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, or whatever, maybe their spleens are no bigger than someone from the US or the UK. Maybe it gets bigger because, as you say, they're diving day in, day out.
So it's an interesting point, and both are true. So if you go back to the Cell paper, it was quite good in that you have a group of the Bajau that don't dive anymore. But they're the same, from the same genetic pool, and they compared their spleens, and they were in fact larger. So it wasn't a genetic component. So they were born with larger spleens, even though they didn't die. But at the same time, you can take a group of naive divers, and there's a researcher that does this. You take a group of naive divers and have them go through a few-week protocol, or I think it's up to 6 weeks of dive training. And she found, this is Erica, she found that the spleens actually do enlarge. So there is an adaptation to the diving, but there's also a genetic component to it, which is
interesting.
Yeah,
my friend she's in Italy now, and she likes swimming. I don't think particularly diving, but she likes swimming. Maybe they do some submersing, and she says she can now hold her breath. I think it was for 3 minutes,
yeah,
which is, we're going to come on to some records, but that's pretty impressive. Like most people, and don't try this at home, but most people would struggle to hold their breath for a minute, I think, unless they're practiced at it, thinking, wow, to
right.
progress to 3 minutes, there must be some noteworthy physiological changes. The bodies, or at least some bodies, are able to adapt quite substantially to this requirement to breath hold.
Yeah, and going back to the studies by Erica, she not only looked at spleens, but also looked at the classic dive response. So the bradycardia, the lowering of heart rate that occurs. And she did find that after a period of dive training, it improved the bradycardia, or the dive response, the lowering of the heart rate, the conservation of oxygen. And so training, you certainly do have that adaptation effect.
And the fact the body's, I think it's fair to say, the fact that the body is able to adapt quite substantially, or at least some people are, may suggest there's previously some evolutionary imperative to potentially be good at diving. I mean, maybe someone will have me up on that, but if there is that inherent plasticity in the system, it suggests the system is evolved to be plastic and for a reason. I mean, there could be counters to that argument, but that's interesting.
Yeah, something's left over there for sure.
Yeah, something's left over. I
We
mean,
should say the biggest thing. So your swimmer example, the biggest thing when it comes to holding your breath for longer. So if you wanted to start yourself, the biggest thing is mental. So we talked about the ducks that were put underwater, and they're in a stressful environment. They couldn't hold their breath for a long time. It's the same with humans. And so you get more comfortable with holding your breath. And that goes a long way. And so you're telling your body that it's okay. And so you're able to relax. So a lot of the elite divers, which I'm sure I get into, they do a sort of meditative, they get into a meditative state before they hold their breath. They lower their heart rate. They try to decrease the so-called stress response, if you will, although their sympathetic stress response goes up during the dive. But they basically are able to lower their heart rate. They're able to just withstand that stress much better. Right?
So that reminds me of an analogy. I was reading a little bit from Tim Noakes the other day, who's an exercise physiologist from South Africa.
Yeah.
One of his arguments is that the brain is a kind of central governor, regulating how hard we exercise when we're in a competitive exercise situation. So you imagine runners, they're running as quick as they can on a marathon, let's say, we're talking endurance exercise.
Mm-hmm.
What limits the pace that they go at in mile 2, even though they're not very tired at mile 2 because they've got to get to mile 26, but they still really don't fancy running above a certain speed, these kind of things. And one of the things he suggests is that, having spoken to a lot of elite athletes, is that they would say it's the mental side which is the ultimate barrier and the ultimate challenge. And that often they are, I mean, obviously they're in physiologically amazing shape, but often it's coming to terms with the fact that their body is screaming at them to stop, or at least slow down, and to override that in one way or the other. Now, saying override sounds like it's kind of pushing back hard, but maybe they can do it sometimes in a meditative style way of just kind of letting the waves of discomfort wash over them and not let it move them. I don't know, but there seems to be some analogy there to the divers. Most of us will know what it's like because we live, well, hopefully only through playing around. You hold your breath, maybe kids do it a bit more, hold the breath and see how long you can do it for, and then you just have to release, right? And that's called air hunger.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't encourage anyone to try and beat that sort of thing. But I guess what you're saying is it fair to say that competitive divers and maybe some of these diving populations like the Bajou,
Yeah.
a big part of staying underwater for a long time and while being active is to accept and deal with the actually chronic acute discomfort
Yeah.
that comes with air hunger.
Correct. Yeah. So absolutely but I would there's a more nuanced argument to that because it certainly isn't all mental. I would say when you are just starting your training, there's that big mental component. But then when you get up to the more elite level, it certainly is the physiology, the adaptations, and the consequences of low oxygen levels, lung squeeze, high carbon dioxide levels. So yeah, to get up to the point of being able to hold your breath 3-4 minutes, a lot of that is mental. Thereafter, it comes more into the physiology, how much oxygen you store in your body, at what critical level of hypoxemia you can withstand, and how low you can drop your metabolism. All right, so and the argument to that, it's not just central governor, because the elite divers can and sometimes do hold their breath until they'll fall unconscious, and that
Right.
is the limit, the limit of hypoxemia, right, before that their brain can handle before they fall unconscious.
Okay, so that's a beautiful segue into competitive diving. So in the modern day, pretty much every vocation possible, there's a competition for it. And the best of the best are extremely good, often professional. I don't know if that's the case for diving. So can you give me, maybe not the exact numbers, but some broad numbers? We're talking about human beings diving. There's broadly two things to compete over: duration of breath hold while underwater,
Yeah.
and then depth. So just to be clear, yeah, how deep below the surface can you get? But you can also do durations where you're barely under the water at all,
Yeah.
but your head is, right, so you can't cheat, but you're under the water, but it's about duration. So what sort of, and the duration ones can be done in a swimming pool, and
They,
the
yeah.
okay, and the depth ones need to be done out in the sea, in the ocean, because we're talking serious depth. So, Anthony, what sort of numbers are we talking about here for depth and duration of the best divers in the world?
So the current world record for depth is 214 meters. So when you look at those, we should go back a little bit and just give a brief history of competitive apnea. So right now, all the apnea records are the governing body is through ADA. So it's the International Association of Apnea Developments. It's a French acronym, so that I just converted to English there. And that was formed in 1992. So since then, they will keep all the records. There are some other unofficial records through Guinness, but generally speaking, the depth and the stat, we call it the just holding your breath for duration, is called a static apnea or static breath hold. So 214 meters. Nietzsche Herbert was the one to do that. Now, the way they do that, the 214 is a no. It's called no limit. So they go down on a sled. Once they're at the bottom, they inflate a balloon, or the sled comes up. There are other categories to depth. So there's the constant weight. There's fins, no fins, and then there's just the line, right? And
So they're working hard, like they've got to put everything into getting down.
yeah.
They haven't got to worry, in inverted commas, about coming up. I mean, they do have to get up, but they're kind of helped with that. And obviously
So
it takes time to come up. So yeah, sorry, give us
yeah.
more.
So again, there are different categories. We just simplified into the two broad categories, being duration and then depth. In reality, there are many more separate categories. So just for example, with depth, the 214-meter record, that category is called no limit. So they're going down on a sled. So they're not working. They're never working. They're never having to fight against buoyancy, especially in that 10 meters. But then you go into other categories where they actually have to propel themselves down and then back up. And then the depth obviously is much less.
So is this a reasonable point to ask this question? Because I know you're giving a bit of history here. When, if they're being propelled down, right?
Yeah.
They're on a sled, you could call it, like a propelled sled. So they're going down at a set speed.
Yeah.
Right. Why shouldn't they just keep on going down and down and down forever? What would limit them?
So when they go down, when they're at depth, the oxygen is not the limiting factor, right? Because the oxygen, it's at a higher pressure, so it's able to get into our blood much easier, right? The lung squeeze is a big factor. So remember, we have Boyle's law. The first 10 meters is 2 atmospheric, or you add another atmospheric pressure. So that's very hard. You get that lung squeeze in the first 10 meters, and then as you go down and go down, it gets worse and worse and worse. Eventually, if you keep going down, you could get a pulmonary edema, or basically blood that gets into the alveoli.
So are the lungs literally getting smaller? Like, just for people to visualize it. So maybe lungs are kind of this big or whatever it is, right? So the pressure of the water as we go down, is that literally squeezing and reducing the size of the lungs?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's the same. So anybody who's gone down just in a pool, just 10 meters, you realize your ears perk, right? So you've got your sinuses are little air cavities. And what's happening there is just the air cavities are getting smaller. So it's causing that pain. All right. So they obviously have to equalize their sinuses. Now they're very good at it. So they can just swallow a couple times, do some techniques, they do it right away. But the lungs keep compressing. So that's the thing they're majorly worried about, especially on the no limits when they're going down quickly. But the other thing, they have to keep recognizing the duration in that they are using oxygen. It's not, they can hold their breath for a long time while at depth, but as they come up, they have to have a reserve, because now the pressure is, you no longer have that driving pressure for oxygen to get into the bloodstream, right? Especially in the last 10 meters, so before they get up to surface. So you lose that driving pressure for oxygen, and if you have depleted stores, that's when you run the risk of what we call shallow water blackout.
So let's just so we got this person at 200 meters depth, with a tiny little lung, because the water's compressed. I mean, I guess the rib cage will to some degree limit how much that lung compresses. Otherwise, those ribs are going to crack.
Right.
And I presume that they don't most of the time. But okay.
Yeah.
Right. And so then the diver decides, that's it, I can't go any deeper, right? So they're going to return. Okay, so they're coming up slowly, and as they come up, their lungs are gradually, and this is through, say, 200 meters depth of water, like it's dark down there. Okay, so they're looking up, they can't even see the surface probably. They're gradually coming up through the water column. So this is, as you say, there's a big physiological component, but this seems incredibly mental as well in both senses of the word, right? Okay, and so they're coming up through the water column, and that lung is expanding, and I think the math says that it expands more rapidly the closer you get to the surface. So it expands slowly, and so actually you said the last 10 meters, like they're nearly home and dry or home and wet. That last 10 meters, which is the bit that you think isn't actually a problem, because lots of people could dive to 10 meters and be okay, right? Even if you're not practiced. I mean, it's a long way down, but it's okay, right? But in that last 10 meters, because you get the most expansion in the lungs, suddenly the little bit of oxygen that's left in the lungs is at a very low pressure, very low concentration, and potentially, I guess, doesn't diffuse from the lungs into the blood because the concentration of oxygen in the lungs is just nothing. Well, very low, sorry. And so at that point, that's when the brain can shut down.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And the reason why it's the last 10 meters, because we take our breath atmospheric pressure, right, which is 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. And when you go to 10 meters, you double that. So every 10 meters is 760 millimeters of mercury. So it's the doubling. So as you go further down, you're no longer doubling, you're just adding another 760, adding another 760 for each 10 meters, but you're not doubling it, right? So that's why the last 10 meters are.
And so ironically, as you mentioned earlier, at those super depths, which are really unnatural for us, there's this paradox where we can really kind of squeeze is not the right scientific word, but squeeze that last bit of oxygen out of our lungs into the blood, because although there's not much oxygen left in the lungs because we've used it, well, we have, the divers used it going down, the bit that's left is at a very high concentration because the lungs are so compressed, and so it can still diffuse into the blood. So weirdly, the body can still use it. But the counter to that is on the way up, as we get back towards safety and kind of land, which is where humans are at their best, just before we get there, boom, the lungs open up a lot, as you've described, and suddenly oxygen levels are super low. And so, I mean, sorry, but divers can pass out they can pass out in those last 10 meters. For a competitive diver, do they like not get their recorded depth if they pass out before they get to the surface?
Yeah, and so that was since ADA came along, which is the governing body for the apnea disciplines, they've been really good at making sure. So they have criteria. You're going for the record. If you come up and you're semi-conscious, that record doesn't count. So you have to be fully alert, right? And they have obviously health officials on there. So the divers, they know, and a lot of it is CO2. So the CO2 is really important, which I hope we'll get to, because that's a trigger to breathe. But they use that as sort of a proxy for what their oxygen levels are, because high CO2 is not going to make them go unconscious, right? It's the low oxygen. But the high CO2 is certainly going to give them that sensation for breathing. It gives them the urge to breathe, the air hunger. Right?
So so we've got this diver, I'm putting them back at 200 meters again. So they're at 200 meters. Why do they decide to stop at, 214 meters is the record.
Right.
Why did he decide to stop at 214 and not 215? What made his decision to say that's enough? Because these people have extreme mentalities. They're very, very driven. They want the best depth they can get. Sometimes they're going for world records. There's a tremendous motivation to go deeper and deeper and deeper. So what makes the decision for that person to stop, particularly because at that moment they don't feel that they've completely run out of oxygen?
Right.
Obviously they've got to count coming back. So what makes them stop at 214 meters?
Yeah, well, there's the sense that, they have to be conscious when they surface. So they do have that drive to breathe from the carbon dioxide that's building up. So they can recognize, and they're looking at their time as well. But the biggest thing as well is the pain from the lung squeeze, which so the barotrauma. So that is very painful to withstand. So the divers that do the best obviously can pack in as much air as possible. So really just enlarge their diaphragm, enlarge their lungs. So there's more of a capacity to squeeze before it gets too painful. So they actually do rib cage. They'll do sort of rib cage compression and expansion exercises as a part of their training program. So that is
to kind of make the lungs more robust. Sorry, Anthony, to literally
the
add strength.
Yeah, because the rib cage, of course, is attached to the lungs. All right, so the pleural. So that as it's getting smaller and smaller, that compression can become very painful. And so I think that's one of the limiting factors. Now, I've never been down at 200 meters, so I couldn't give you a personal answer about that. But just from a physiologic perspective, that's what it would be.
does anyone go down with them actually? Is there somehow someone in a little sub or something who goes down to monitor them or anything like that? Are they on their own at that
Yeah,
stage?
so 214 meters, it's very hard to get to on scuba. You
Right.
need mixed gases and saturation diving at that point. So there aren't people at the lower limits. There are safety divers, and different competitions have different safety divers at different levels. I couldn't give you an exact depth of where they're at, but they're along the line somewhere, but certainly not as far when you reach the limits of scuba. Now they're on like mixed gases, but even still, when you reach the limit of that, the free divers are going lower, which is incredible to think about. The people, the athlete, the diver that doesn't have the scuba, they're actually going deeper.
Yeah, I mean that is mentally another tricky thing for them to think they've gone past the last scuba diver and they're still going. I think that would psych
Yeah,
me out if they
yeah, and it's
just
dark and yeah.
just briefly actually on these mixed gases. So one might imagine that the scuba divers who are going down, they're kind of sat there, I think, at certain levels in the water. They're there, they're available to the free diver, to the breath holder if they need them. And okay, so they're
And
sat there and
that's the most
they
important.
okay, they're there for support, and they've got a scuba of oxygen that will keep them going. But it's not necessarily just oxygen or an air mix. Even you're saying there can be other mixes that scuba divers will take if they're going extra deep. So not to 200 meters, but maybe going to 100 meters, which is super deep. What would be in their scuba gear? What gas mixes would they have?
So the biggest thing is to get rid of the nitrogen, because as soon as we go below 30, 40 meters, if you're breathing a gas with 79% nitrogen, that nitrogen actually becomes um, uh, not a toxin, but you hallucinate on it. You get what's called nitrogen narcosis, and you get delirious. So you need to get rid of the nitrogen, and the nitrogen also has if you get too much nitrogen in your blood system, then you have to take a long time to get back up, or else you risk the decompression sickness or the bends you may have heard, which is when those nitrogen bubbles expand. That's why they call it the bends, because it usually happens in the elbows. That's where the pain happens. But that can cause or an
So
embolize.
let's just go through that a little bit more, and then we'll come back to why we need the mixed gas in the. Well, you can explain to me because I must admit I'm not very clear on it. But for the for the bends, which is the kind of classic, and it's quite an old phrase, and it was quite common in divers in the past. I hope a lot less so now. So in the air that we breathe now, you and I think, are both breathing about 79% nitrogen. So most of the air is nitrogen, and it's an inert gas,
Yeah,
but it causes problems in this inhuman environment. The lungs compress, as we discussed. So the
not,
concentration of
not on
nitrogen.
scuba. Not on
No,
scuba.
no, no. Right, but in the free diver, that is that right? They've got the problem. So the lungs are compressing, so the nitrogen is compressing, so more nitrogen's getting into the blood, like oxygen's getting into the blood,
Yeah,
more nitrogen's getting into the blood. So you've got all this nitrogen in the blood, and again, it's not on the way down, is it? It's on the way back. So on the way to safety, as the lung expands, is that well? Sorry, no, no. It's not as the lung is. I beg your pardon. It's as the pressure on the body is taken off, the nitrogen that has found its way into the blood, that more nitrogen than normal because of the concentration in the lungs. That nitrogen that's found its way into the blood that expands and can form tiny little bubbles. I
correct. Yeah,
think okay, and those little bubbles are evil,
yeah.
and they can cause a lot of problem in the joints and so forth. But okay, so how does a free diver, like so someone not with a scuba, how do they get around this other problem then of
Yeah.
of the bends?
Well, remember, they only have their lungs that's containing nitrogen. So the bends usually isn't an issue for free divers because they're not continually taking in more nitrogen, exhaling, taking in more, right? They don't have that tank that they're
Right,
inhaling at pressure, right?
right.
So for a single dive, you're not worried about nitrogen decompression sickness for the bends. it actually can become a problem if they're doing repeated dives throughout an entire day, because they are getting more nitrogen into their blood, right, from the lungs. So if they're doing, 50 to 100 dives in a day, let's say the spear fishermen, they're going down try to find it, there have been reports of decompression sickness in those free divers, but you have to take multiple dives. On a single dive, you've got your lungs full of that nitrogen, so it's never an issue for the free divers.
But sorry, right. So I get you. So for the scuba divers, what they don't want to be doing is going quite deep, 100 meters or something, with a canister with scuba equipment with compressed air in it, because that means an awful lot of compressed nitrogen.
Yeah.
Right, and that gets into their blood.
That gets into their blood. So acutely, what would happen to them when they're at pressure is they would hallucinate. That's the nitrogen narcosis, or laughing gas. When we take laughing gas, it's the same mechanism. So at a certain level, some divers will actually go down to try to achieve that. But it's dangerous, right? So you need to be careful with that. And then oxygen itself can be toxic at high pressures. Too much oxygen can be toxic. So when you're going down really deep on external gas mixtures, so scuba, you need to adjust your oxygen levels as well. And then you typically replace the nitrogen with helium, which is less dense, right? And you don't develop the decompression sickness from helium.
I see. So replace the nitrogen with helium, another inert gas that doesn't cause bubbles in the blood or hallucinations either.
Yes.
Okay, so helium oxygen or heliox, is it sometimes called heliox?
Helium and
right.
oxygen. Yeah.
Okay, gosh. So right.
It still takes a long time to come back up, though. If you're at that depth, you need to take time to come back up for a scuba diver.
You can't just rush up to the surface and breathe a sigh of relief.
Yeah. So we didn't touch on. So we got sidetracked, which is great. We talked about the depth records, 214 meters. Do you want to get into the static or the?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So with this discipline, now they're just face down on the surface, but their head is underwater, so they're still eliciting that trigeminal reflex, or the mammalian dive response, as we like to call it. All right. So now the record, according to ADA, right, which is the International Association for Development of Apnea. Again, it's a French acronym. That record for men is 11 minutes 35 seconds by Stefan Mifsud. I don't know if I pronounced his name correctly. And then for women, it's 9 minutes and 2 seconds. So incredible.
It's incredible. So, okay, now what? Right. So visually, or in one, no, it's not in visual, it's in one's imagination. It doesn't have quite the kind of extraordinary sense that you have as someone diving to 200 meters.
Right.
It's much more mundane. So you could do it in a swimming pool, and okay, there aren't other people around, but you've just got somebody with a stopwatch basically next to it. But nonetheless, it's equally as impressive. Now, they haven't got any problems with lung compression, nitrogen narcosis, any of these things.
Mm-hmm.
It really is down to them, their physiology and their mind for 10 odd minutes. Right.
Yeah.
No, so what makes these guys stop?
Yeah. So it's a different mechanism. It's related, but different than the depth dives. Depth dive more related to the barotrauma, the squeeze, but they're not going down there for 10 minutes. It's much shorter. Right? So when the people that just hold their breath for a long time, ultimately the break point for these elite divers is just a critical level of oxygen before they'll lose consciousness. Now, just like the depth dives, when they come up, they have to show that they're coherent and they're not at risk for losing consciousness. because most all of the best freedivers, at least that train to hold their breath for a long time, can hold their breath until they lose consciousness.
Oh, wow. That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Okay. How on earth? Because I've tried holding my breath in the past, just kind of out of personal interest, weirdly. And there's just a point where you just have to breathe. It's excruciating. There's no choice.
Yeah. So I think it's a good time to get into the mechanisms of what causes that air hunger.
Please.
Yeah. So there's three sort of interrelated factors that are ongoing. The first thing is you have your brainstem itself, so the respiratory rhythm generator in the pons that is continually active, continually sending stress signals out that we need to continue this breathing cycle. You have higher brain centers that are also going down to the pons saying we need to continue this brain cycle. Now, that's where the mental component comes in. You can kind of silence that. You have stretch receptors in your lungs that want this sort of sinusoidal increase stretch, decrease stretch, increase stretch, decrease stretch. When you inhibit that, then these signals to breathe will continually rise. So it's your brain, your lungs, and then the most important is what we call these chemoreceptors. So receptors that are found in your brain and in your neck and the carotid bodies. They respond to carbon dioxide and oxygen. Just carbon dioxide in the brain, both oxygen levels and carbon dioxide in the neck and the carotid bodies. So when you initially hold your breath, let's say we're doing it, we're untrained divers. Okay, so within the first 30 seconds, you get that air hunger, right? Most of that is actually coming from the carbon dioxide, because it's the levels of carbon dioxide that will ultimately dictate the moment-to-moment breathing. So when you're exercising, for example, now there are multiple factors going on, but you have that increased urge to breathe. A lot of that's coming from carbon dioxide.
So the increased carbon dioxide being produced by the body, by the cells as they respire, and that builds up in the body, in the blood and so forth.
Yeah.
The carotid bodies and so forth notice that. So it's not so much the drop in oxygen that's causing that discomfort. It's actually the increased levels of carbon dioxide.
Correct.
Okay.
And especially at 30 seconds, your levels of oxygen, you're not responding to that at all. Although the pressure of oxygen, you have to get into the weeds a little bit when you talk about partial pressure versus oxygen saturation, the oxygen dissociation curve. But to try to stay away from that best we can, at 30 seconds to even a minute, your oxygen saturation, so the amount of oxygen that's saturated on hemoglobin, is still 100 to 90%, right? And our chemoreceptors don't actually respond to the levels of oxygen until saturation begins to really precipitously fall, so below 90%. In fact, it happens much sooner than that, but it's that's when you get off the so-called flat portion of the dissociation curve. But let's go back to the first minute of your breath hold. You have the partial pressure of oxygen is in fact going down immediately when you stop breathing. But you've got this buffer, and you've got a buffer until the saturation will begin to fall. And it's not until the saturation begins to fall that's when we get these signals from our chemoreceptors. So the first minute of your breath hold is really all carbon dioxide, which is why if we hyperventilate, we increase our respiration before we hold our breath. Everyone can do this. You'll be able to hold your breath for much longer. And that's because you're breathing off the CO2 by hyperventilating, you're exhaling more CO2.
Right, so doing this for a good few breaths before holding the breath is not getting more oxygen into the body. What it's doing is blowing off CO2. So you start with a lower body CO2 level so that they've got longer to build up before they hit some point that the body sets off its alarms.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the first minute. Now we get past that. You still have, again, you've got these higher brain centers, your pulmonary stretch receptors that are in the background. They're still kind of adding to that urge to breathe. But the main thing, again, carbon dioxide signals are starting the alarm, ringing the alarm. And then when your saturation begins to fall, then these chemoreceptors kind of double up. They'll start responding even more, right? So eventually you get to a point where the urge to breathe is so forceful, all these signals coming in are so strong that your diaphragm will actually contract. And this is called an involuntary breathing movement. Some people call it different names, but generally we call it an involuntary breathing movement in the literature. So at that point, usually that happens around, it depends on how relaxed the diver is, but generally it'll happen around 3 to 4 minutes. So this is where the untrained breath holder will begin to breathe, right? When you have that involuntary contraction. But the elite guys, they are able to keep their mouth closed and just keep holding their breath while their diaphragm is actually contracting. And so now they enter what we call the struggle phase of the apnea, or the breathostatic apnea. And so that's the second half. That's kind of the harder phase, if you will, because you're getting these continual involuntary breathing movements. And so it's almost like a lot of cardiovascular changes are happening then too. But still, it's getting harder and harder. Your carbon dioxide levels are still going up. Now your oxygen levels are going down. But these elite guys are able to sort of withstand that stress up to a point of where they realize their oxygen levels are going down too far, too below, approximately once you get to an oxygen saturation of around 60, then they'll break their breath hold. And
they have no choice, or they kind of choose to because they know that otherwise they might go unconscious.
Correct. Yeah, that's it. So any further than that, so the theoretical limit for consciousness is an oxygen saturation of around 50%. So
wow.
they're basically going right up to that, and these are of course these are the best of the best. Right? Their carbon dioxide levels are really high, but all the carbon dioxide is really doing, well, it's probably doing some good things, but the biggest thing is it's just telling them they need to breathe. It's causing those involuntary breathing movements. But it's the critical level of oxygen that's very important for the record breakers, at least.
So these guys are able to kind of beat their own body's attempts to make them breathe, such that under duress, obviously, they are then monitoring their own sort of sensations, and trying to estimate when their oxygen levels have dropped to a point that they're going to lose out on getting the time recorded, because they're going to lose consciousness or semi-lose consciousness, at which point it will be adjudicated that it's not a clean kind of breath hold, right? Wow. And so that is massively different. In fact, is almost diametrically opposed to, I think, what most people would experience in terms of breath holding, that if they do that, they feel they have absolutely no choice but to simply breathe. These people are able, along with all their physiological capacity, as it were, to override that and kind of take the reins of control. And then the main thing they've got to do is choose when to stop, so that they push within reason as close as they can, but without any sense of unconsciousness. If they're down on the canvas for 10, as it were, they're out. They can't allow that, because then they lose the record. I mean, that's a very, very different experience of holding one's breath.
Yes, yeah. And that's where you said the reining the controls, that's where the mental component comes in. And so through training, through repetitive exposure, they get more comfortable with being uncomfortable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. And Okay, and one more thing, these guys, so the duration people, not the depth people, the duration people, would I be right in saying it's highly unlikely that they're going to lose their life doing that? Whereas for the depth people, I mean, obviously most of them don't, but there is a genuine risk of death because of the various issues
Right.
we've mentioned.
Yeah.
Anthony, is there, all sports at some point have doping? Is there doping in diving?
There is. Yeah. Yeah. And so we've done some neat studies and to try to look at, what's the best way we could just physiologically, how can we increase the duration of the breath hold in these elite people? And so you just go to the fundamentals. Okay, what do we need to do? We need to conserve oxygen. So how does the body conserve oxygen? Well, it slows heart rate, right? Peripheral constrict. So the first thing we did was, well, let's go after slowing heart rate, see how that works. We can easily do it. Give a beta blocker. Right? So we give beta blockers to these divers and then get them to hold their breath. Lo and behold, they can hold their breath for much longer.
This is duration stuff, not depth stuff.
Duration, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. I'm glad to hear it. But okay, no, very interesting. Carry on. Okay, so
So they hold their breath for much longer. So ADA has banned beta blockades in diving because it's an ergogenic aid. It's doping, if you will.
so do they have to give a urine sample after they've done yeah, okay.
Yeah. So that's the main one. There are some other tactics that a lot of divers have been trying. One of them is sodium bicarbonate, just to try to get rid of the acidity, the increase in CO2, and maybe that will help them relax a little bit. Because you remember, these involuntary breathing movements are metabolically taxing to some extent. So if you can limit the onset, or if you increase the duration before you get to those involuntary breathing movements, you're going to be able to relax better. You're going to be able to conserve oxygen. Now, with sodium bicarbonate, generally it's failed. You can't get around the GI distress. Anyone who has taken a sodium bicarbonate supplement will know that it causes a lot of GI distress. And if you're trying to relax and hold your breath while having severe GI distress, it's not going to produce a record. We've also played around with actually taking away the signal from the carotid bodies. And we did that through using a drug, dopamine, in very low concentrations. So we infuse this dopamine in very low concentrations. It actually silences the carotid bodies. Wow. So, well, if we take away the carotid bodies, the signal to breathe, will that help them hold their breath for longer? And we actually found a very interesting thing. In the trained but not the ultra elite divers, it absolutely did increase their duration. But in the very best, the best of the best, the record holders, it didn't increase their duration at all. In fact, in some cases, it decreased their breath hold duration. Right? So they relied on that signal. And when you took it away, they didn't know what to really do. And in some cases, it can increase your heart rate as well, which is obviously
doesn't help. But you wonder if the very, very top guys, then they've already got the carotids under control.
Right.
Yeah.
And
actually, as you say, they need them. They've got them under control, but they still need to sort of listen to them, as it were.
Yeah.
To know when to stop. Otherwise, yeah, you've taken away their sight.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's also implications. So the carotid body is also involved in, remember, the mammalian dive reflex that we talked about. So if you take away that signal, you may also be taking away some of their natural reflex to hold their breath longer, which is, again, mainly that slowing of the heart rate. So beta blockers absolutely work. Anything else that we've tried doesn't really work. Again, depending on which level you're at. If you or I were to take this low dose dopamine, we could certainly hold our breath for much longer.
Oof, that's interesting. That is interesting. Okay. Well, it's not my sport, so I won't have to.
Right.
Otherwise, I'd be very tempted.
Well,
Maybe.
you have to, I think it has to be intravenous. So
Okay, need some two more things. Two more things to touch on, which I think we haven't really. You might mention the word something called lung packing.
right.
Now, I think this is a behavior which can help, again, duration divers or maybe depth divers as well,
Yeah.
and something that, you know, regular people who don't do these competitions, they wouldn't have at their fingertips. But this is a kind of, yeah, an extra skill that can add some more time onto your dive. Can you tell us
Yeah.
about lung packing?
Yeah. So it's the short and simple of it is just getting as much air in your body, in your lungs as possible. So if you take a full breath in up to your, what we call total lung capacity, if you will. Now there's a technique called lung packing, or more scientifically, glossopharyngeal insufflation, where they'll use the neck muscles to actually kind of take in, they're not swallowing it, but taking it into their trachea, really just expanding that rib cage, expanding their lungs. And so they're inflating their lungs to the absolute maximum. And it takes training to actually do this lung packing. And there is sort of a set way to do it, but interestingly, everyone sort of has their own technique when you watch these divers. Some people gasp in, some people kind of suck in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's again, but it's using the glossopharyngeal muscles to really just pack in as much air as possible into the lungs.
And that's for the duration divers, not the depth divers.
That's both. So with the depth divers, remember there's this squeeze. So if you have a larger amount to squeeze, you're going to be able to go down deeper.
Yeah, it kind of protects them a little bit from this lung squeeze because they've got a bit more air in the lungs to push back against the pressure of
There's
the
more
water.
air. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so that helps them
Yeah.
too.
Probably, the airways are sort of relatively rigid, right? The trachea is rigid, but it does have this little collapsible, the back of it is somewhat collapsible.
Right.
When you cough really hard, it can actually collapse. What I'm imagining is happening with the glossopharyngeal insufflation is they're probably, even the airways, the large airways, the bronchi, the trachea is probably getting a little bit bigger too, in some extent. So now those studies haven't been done, but if I was just to guess, I would bet that they're a little bit bigger.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Now, one more. What?
I should say, I know if we're pressed for time, but the glossopharyngeal insufflation, one thing it does, the lungs surround the heart.
Uh-huh.
So when you're surrounding the heart, you're compressing the heart. Now you need to really increase heart rate. So you'll see it that when you do that glossopharyngeal insufflation, the heart rate at the start is very high because stroke volume, the amount that's being pumped out, is very low.
Because the heart's kind of compressed, so it's not got the space to kind of fill up.
Yeah.
So its pumps each time are smaller.
Correct.
Right.
When we give beta blockers, there's some people who are really good at the glossopharyngeal insufflation. When you give them beta blockers, when they take that deep breath in, we prevented that increase in heart rate, but now their stroke volume is very slow. That actually became a problem. So they actually did semi-fall unconscious just right at the onset because they're compressing the heart so much.
And when these people fall unconscious, when that happens, their bodies correct fairly quickly, I guess. I mean, they breathe properly, that the physiology kind of resets, and fairly quickly they're kind of back to normal.
Provided they're not underwater. And so we're doing all our tests. When we do these things, we're having them lie in a hospital bed.
Perfect.
Yeah. So yeah.
Cerebral hypometabolism. Where does that come into the story?
That's when we first started looking at these breath hold divers, we didn't come at it from a lens of this is really cool. We just want to study how far they can go. We came at it from a lens of how does the brain actually cope under these extremes extreme levels of hypoxemia, low oxygen, extreme levels of carbon dioxide, high carbon dioxide, because it's high. And so we were looking at brain blood flow and then metabolism and then all the other brain metrics. And then through that, one interesting thing came as this was after 3 studies. On each one, we're actually looking at brain metabolism. So we had catheters sampling blood exiting the brain, so the jugular bulb, and then blood coming into the brain. So then we can get through the Fick equation when we're actually measuring brain blood flow as well, you can get metabolism. And what we found was that at the very end of the breath hold, when the carbon dioxide levels are really high, but the oxygen levels are also very low, you actually do get a little bit of hypometabolism. Your brain is using less oxygen. It doesn't require as much oxygen. So we found that quite interesting. And in fact, you could attribute that to sort of a protective mechanism. So it's not using as much, just sort of the bare minimum to stay conscious, if you will.
So that, as far as I'm aware, that's not been observed in any other context. I mean, I was always led to understood that the brain's oxygen levels and blood flow is very carefully protected.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we did a couple follow-ups to that. So first, we have what's going on. Okay, well, oxygen levels are very low, carbon dioxide is very high. The next study we did was we want to tease that out. Is it the low oxygen or is it the high carbon dioxide? So the next thing we did was a breath hold, an oxygen-assisted breath hold, where they will hyperventilate on 100% oxygen before they hold their breath. So in that case, they actually never become hypoxemic. And then you can extend the breath hold for up to the record's close to 25 minutes. So it's a very long time, but because it's a longer time, you're developing far more carbon dioxide. You're still producing carbon dioxide, so you're getting much more acidic. So then we can basically partition out the hypoxemia from the hypercapnia. The hypercapnia would say high carbon dioxide. And what we found was that with the oxygen-assisted breath hold, then their metabolism went even further down. So they became more hypometabolism, if you will. So it's a consequence of the high CO2, which is lowering the metabolism. So in effect, you could think the CO2 may in fact be protective.
So the high CO2 could be encouraging the body to reduce metabolic rate,
Especially
in an attempt to stretch out the amount of time that one can survive, basically, without on a breath hold. So encouraging that, including even in the brain. So even the brain is being sacrificed, not the brain being sacrificed, but there's some temporary reduction in oxygen and probably metabolic rate in the brain, temporary, in an attempt to stretch out the duration of life without a breath.
So since then, we've done a series of studies, and this has a lot of implications for how we interpret even things like bold imaging, where if you give someone 5% CO2 and you're trying to measure blood flow, well, you have to assume that metabolism is the same. So we've done a series of other, led by my PhD supervisor, Phil Ainsley, a series of other experiments looking at the effects of carbon dioxide on brain metabolism out of the context of breath holding. And so now we just give people, if you give CO2 while they're breathing, or you take away CO2, there's 42 participants where we actually have brain metabolism with manipulations in CO2, and pretty clearly we show that high CO2 levels are actually reducing the brain metabolism. And that paper is currently under review right now, so hopefully it will come out soon.
So that's interesting because, very interesting. I mean, you could get high CO2 levels in other contexts. I mean, is this hypometabolism of the brain, is this only associated with diving? It could be, because these breath hold dives are extreme, or could it generalize to some degree? I mean, CO2 levels presumably can go up quite high during certain activities and exercise. Are our
Yeah,
Are
well,
our brains in some situations getting less oxygen in those situations, do you think? Well, sorry, lower metabolic rate, less oxygen and lower metabolic rate in some of those situations?
during exercise?
Yeah,
No, no. During exercise, your brain metabolism actually increases.
despite CO2 levels going up.
Yeah, because CO2 levels don't go up by that much.
Okay.
We're talking, so you're breathing more, right? So if your baseline is about 40 during exercise, you may go up to 42, 43. And again, it's offset by that increase in respiration. Right? So we're talking about going up to 50, 55 millimeters of mercury. So much, much higher than anything you're going to get from exercise. Yeah, but again, we did find it out of the context of freediving, right? Because we did the studies where we're not holding the breath. We give the CO2, and you do get this hypometabolism.
Okay, gosh. Well, yeah, that's a particularly interesting physiological finding, and I'm looking forward to what you find next.
Yeah.
Just to finish on, for anybody who's interested in starting to breath hold dive, not necessarily going for world records in the future, but maybe they are, but they'd like to do some diving where they don't bother, let's say, with scuba equipment, for example. What would be your advice to them if they're looking to improve their breath holding capabilities?
Right. So I don't know if I can give them any advice, but I would tell them what I would do. Um, so the first thing is accidents happen when you're in water. So if you just want to practice holding your breath for as long as you can, there's very little danger just doing it when you're lying down or when you're at your desk. Chances are you're not going to be able to hold your breath until you fall unconscious. So you can hold it for as long as you can, try to get those involuntary breathing movements, and there's really no harm in that until you start to get up to the longer durations, and there might be some indications that there's brain parenchymal, very small damage, but whether that actually translates to long-term damage, we don't know. Probably not. But again, the accidents happen underwater. So especially if you do want to, there's some swimmers that are doing the breath hold, especially when they dive in and they're swimming underwater. Stay away from hyperventilating before you do it. That's what I would do, because again, hyperventilating, with hyperventilation, you're removing the CO2 drive to breathe, right? So especially if you're going at depth a little bit, you may feel like you don't need to breathe at all. You're going to stay under there for far too long. When you come up, that's when shallow water blackout happens. And again, it's drowning. It's the pulmonary edema. It's from taking in water. That's what causes injury and death, or these accidents, right? So if you are doing it, if you do want to try doing depth dives, the biggest thing is do it with someone else. Be controlled and do not hyperventilate before. Even the elite divers, they will not hyperventilate before a depth dive.
Wow. Okay. Well, if the best don't do it, then the rest of us shouldn't either.
They need that CO2. They need that stimulus.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. So yeah, we mustn't focus just on the oxygen. It's the CO2 and it's the signals. We do need the signals to tell us when enough is enough.
Yeah. For a static, some people generally they stay away from too much hyperventilating, but through the preparations and then through the lung packing, we actually find that there is some mild hyperventilation that does happen. Yeah. So I mean that, but again, it's on surface. You're not going down to depth, so it's generally not a major issue.
That's interesting. So even with just even with the duration dives where there isn't that risk of being at depth, the top breath holders, again, they're not trying to stop the carotid bodies coming into play or hold them off, delay them. In this case, through hyperventilation, they're accepting those signals, they're dealing with them, and they're still listening to them because they need to decide when they are going to stop and release and take a breath. Right. Okay. So the lesser athletes will try and stave off the carotid bodies bothering them. Let me say that again. The lesser athletes will try and stave off the carotid bodies bothering them. The best athletes don't. They accept it and listen to them. Is that broadly fair?
Yeah, broadly. They do hyperventilate a little bit.
Okay.
But and then they try to, of course, relax. Right. The biggest thing is relax. And when I'm doing this, and I've never trained, but I've certainly tried several times, and I got up to 4 minutes, which I thought was great at one point when I was actually working in Croatia. The biggest thing is that just relaxation. Understand that your oxygen levels are fine, especially within the first 3 minutes. Your oxygen levels are absolutely fine. It's the carbon dioxide that's really telling you to breathe, right? So you've got those first involuntary breathing movements. If you can figure out how to withstand them, how to kind of hold them, they can actually be your friend. In some cases, they will alleviate some of the sensation through the stretch receptors. It's that sensation to breathe, that urge to breathe. Eventually, it does get harder and harder. But yeah, the very first few, it can actually take off some of that stress, and then it gets hard again.
Well, end it on that note. That's super interesting. That's super interesting way to finish it. Dr. Anthony Baines, where can people find out more about you and find more of your work?
I generally keep a low social profile, but I am on Twitter, sort of. It's at Bain PhD. But mainly just, if you're interested in the research, keep a pulse on what comes out in the literature. So PubMed is always a good source. If you want to look at all the diving stuff that I've published, I think there's maybe 15 or so papers out there, and just Bain, AR, and then apnea, and that will you'll be able to find the breadbasket.
Brilliant. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the conversation. I've learned so much. Super interesting topic. Fascinating to think about these extremes. Really interesting physiology underlying it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you. So I mean but again, it's on surface. You're not going down to depth, so it's generally not a major issue.
That's interesting. So even with just even with the duration dives where there isn't that risk of being at depth, the top breath holders, again, they're not trying to stop the carotid bodies coming into play or hold them off, delay them. In this case, through hyperventilation, they're accepting those signals, they're dealing with them, and they're still listening to them because they need to decide when they are going to stop and release and take a breath. Right. Okay. So the lesser athletes will try and stave off the carotid bodies bothering them. Let me say that again. The lesser athletes will try and stave off the carotid bodies bothering them. The best athletes don't. They accept it and listen to them. Is that broadly fair?
Yeah, broadly. They do hyperventilate a little bit.
Okay.
But and then they try to, of course, relax. Right. The biggest thing is relax. And when I'm doing this, and I've never trained, but I've certainly tried several times, and I got up to 4 minutes, which I thought was great at one point when I was actually working in Croatia. The biggest thing is that just relaxation. Understand that your oxygen levels are fine, especially within the first 3 minutes. Your oxygen levels are absolutely fine. It's the carbon dioxide that's really telling you to breathe, right? So you've got those first involuntary breathing movements. If you can figure out how to withstand them, how to kind of hold them, they can actually be your friend. In some cases, they will alleviate some of the sensation through the stretch receptors. It's that sensation to breathe, that urge to breathe. Eventually, it does get harder and harder. But yeah, the very first few, it can actually take off some of that stress, and then it gets hard again.
Well, end it on that note. That's super interesting. That's super interesting way to finish it. Dr. Anthony Baines, where can people find out more about you and find more of your work?
I generally keep a low social profile, but I am on Twitter, sort of. It's at Bain PhD, but mainly just, if you're interested in the research, keep a pulse on what comes out in the literature. So PubMed is always a good source. If you want to look at all the diving stuff that I've published, I think there's maybe 15 or so papers out there, and just Bain, AR, and then apnea, and that will you'll be able to find the breadbasket.
Brilliant. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the conversation. I've learned so much. Super interesting topic. Fascinating to think about these extremes. Really interesting physiology underlying it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was brilliant. Really interesting. Really interesting. Yeah, it brought back, I started remembering some stuff as we were having the conversation, actually, some bits, and lots of new things there. Yeah, it's eminently fascinating topic.
I know, you go down so many rabbit holes, and it's just
yeah, which is great.
Yeah.
There's so much.
I could talk about this. I could go into that, but that's sort of off topic. I wrote something for the conversation. It's not really a journal.
I know. Yeah.
And I don't know if you came across it, but I got a lot of press on. So I wrote a piece on Avatar 2. The Avatar: The Way of the World.
Yes.
Have you seen it?
I haven't had the pleasure.
Okay, I actually haven't seen it either. But so it got a lot of press because Kate Winslet, who's one of the main actors in that movie, she now holds the record for the longest breath hold on a movie set. Before it was who was it? The guy after the Top Gun guy. Why am I blanking on his name? Doesn't matter. Anyway, so she held her breath for over 7 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And she was getting a lot of press for it. So I had to go out there, and I basically wrote this piece on the conversation explaining how she did it. And she did it using supplementary oxygen, so pre-breathing on that 100% oxygen. And I mean, you can go back 1959, Clock and Ron, who are famous respiratory physiologists, they did that in naive breath hold divers, so just people like you and I. And the maximum breath hold times was 6 to 14 minutes. So when you pre-breathe 100% oxygen, right? Because this is something we could have got into, but it obviously you don't have the oxygen effects, but secondarily it blunts the carotid body's response to carbon dioxide.
Right.
So it has a dual effect. Yeah.
So in fact, it was that blunting of the carotids that enabled. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from her, but enabled her to hold her breath for 7 minutes.
And the removal of the oxygen stimulus. Yeah.
And was that dangerous?
No, but so not for 7 minutes, and then obviously you can't breathe 100% oxygen for too long. Then it can become dangerous. The maximum time that at least the elite guys do it, Budimir, who holds the record, and I've worked with him closely, the maximum time is 15 minutes. They're hyperventilating on the 100% oxygen. But for 7 minutes, not dangerous. Longer than that, you actually run the risk of lung collapse, so atelectasis, and it's been documented. So the same thing sort of as lung squeeze, except different mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So what's happening is there's a disproportionate amount of oxygen coming from the lungs into your bloodstream compared to the carbon dioxide going from the bloodstream to your lungs, so your lungs will shrink, right? And so if you watch these guys at the end of holding their breath for that long, they will actually, they're not exhaling, they're inhaling, because their lungs have just gotten so small. But yeah, it's very, very interesting. I think there's some, the carbon dioxide levels are so high too. Incredible hypometabolism, some hallucinations going on as well. The divers call it samba. When they get into a state of samba, it's kind of hallucinating.
I hadn't heard of that. Wow. There's a
Yeah.
lot going on. Sounds like great fun if you can get there.
Yeah, yeah.